Hi there, Mondian Astro Oracles, and I'm glad to be with you, and thank you for being here. And I'm coming to you from Palenque, Chiapas, still in Mexico, but down in the tropical lowlands where it's very, very hot and humid, I might say. So this is an entirely new climate, and it seems to have that ability to sort of dissolve you from the inside out, just molding you open and making your pores sweat like crazy. So you sort of melt into that humidity that surrounds you, and that's of course just me talking about this topic, which I find infinitely fascinating, which is like how does our circumstances, the places we are born, the cultures we are raised in, and the climate, of course, and the landscapes, how do they sort of configure and determine our immediate experience? Because at the same time, if you're joining me here, you're likely joining me from a completely different place in the world, and that is there's of course a universal element in humanity which this channeling indeed sort of speaks to. And that is the topic that I'm going to channel Shiva on in a little bit. It's the topic of non-duality, and of course we're going to speak with the Lord of Consciousness and an Indian deity on this. But non-duality, it implicitly refers to the Indian, let's call it theological tradition or philosophical tradition of Vedanta, which is often also thought of as classical Hinduism, but this tradition that arises around a reception of the Vedas in particular, and which of course deals with how to speak about the ineffable or the unspeakable, and it's actually a tradition that sort of stretches from Spain to Japan, I think, at least in the era of the High Middle Ages, and a long time before that also, but what in the West is called negative theology. So the idea that you can only speak about God or the Absolute in negative terms, and that doesn't mean that you can only say bad things about him. It means that you cannot say anything affirmative about the Absolute. So the idea is that you can only say what God isn't. So if you were to say God is love, that would be restricting the Absolute into a concept of love, which of course can't contain the pure sublime essence of the actual divine. And so this tradition, which I believe it still lives on in more of Eastern Christianity and the Orthodox churches, and of course has a lot of different expressions, but they sort of all address the idea that how do you speak about something which is essentially absolute and beyond differences. And if you know anything about logic, then logic operates with the basic Aristotelian axiom that A is not A, that is A is not B, that is it relies on differences to determine anything, and it relies on the fact that, well, two separate concepts can be used to define each other exactly by the idea that they are not identical. But of course what happens in classical Hinduism, where it's very pronounced, is the realization of the Tattvamasi, meaning you are that, and this essentially simply speaks to the fact that you are the infinity of the whole, and the infinity of the whole is somehow you, and those two are identical, which is a non-dual way of thinking. But of course, as soon as you imply that there is a this and a that, you are lost in duality again. So it's this slippery slope of language and thought that it sort of tries to deal with. And of course, what very much happens in the Indian traditions is that that you then assign a level of practices to this instead. So we also think of this as yoga, even though that's kind of one of the separate schools of Indian thought. But of course, the culture is sort of, the religious culture is sort of permeated about, well, both pujas and bhakti, like regular devotion, and then of course also the more esoteric techniques of breathing and meditation and mantra and what have you. But before I go on about this, because there are excellent tutorials and many other YouTube channels where you can sort of get good guides to this, and I can recommend the Swedish dude over at Let's Talk Religion, who does excellent stuff on this and other religious topics. But I thought it would be very interesting to try to get a channel perspective on as well. So let's hear from Lord Shiva and see what he has to say about it. Yes, just as you see these two hands meet, what is perceived as two different hands from the human perspective is from the perspective of the divine, construed as one unity of hands meeting each other. And why would there be a difference? Notice that things mirror themselves rather than oppose each other. This is a worldview that you are beginning to realize. And I, the force that you know as Shiva, the Lord of Consciousness, I speak to this circumstance. And I allow for you to realize that this reality is more of a set of patterns that repeat themselves, reiterate themselves on different levels. What your mathematics and your visual arts have construed as fractals, those to us are known simply as emanations, as avatars. And so in the way that I perceive the world from on high, and the way that all of the divine perceive whatever is through this idea of repetition. That is, we only see separateness as a type of forgetting or loss of what is already embedded there. You may think of yourself as separate and thereby opposed to other things, that is, existing in dual relationships. But rather, you find yourself in a set of associations, and the boundary between you and these associations is sensitive at best. It is only, quite literally, a type of preliminary boundaries that you set up around yourself in order for you to, well, move safely onward onto the next step. That is, a certain degree of definition is necessary in the process of awakening. If you did not perceive yourself as separate, there would be no veils to throw off. There would be nothing to reveal to you, because you would already realize that you are in complete union with Maya, being the conscious force that permeates everything. But, well, you are not quite there yet, are you? And so what are the reasons that you are not there yet? Is it because you actually exist in a world of oppositions? Or is it because this hall of mirrors that you find yourself in is actually prodding you and provoking you to feel yourself absorbed in it? Notice this is the immediate reality of the child. It is to enter into a type of absorption with whatever it beholds, and whatever it holds So the child, by picking up a plastic shovel, will become being with plastic shovel. There is no opposition to it. It is simply extending itself into a higher permutation of its being, that is a permutation of its being that's not limited by its own bodily capabilities, but is instead defined by the idea of always extending, always becoming more, always taking in more and more into its being. And so a thing that relates to this is the child's relationship to food. See, here it also, or quite literally, takes things into its being and uses it to build itself up into a new and more complex physical organism with higher degrees of movement and of capacity. But at the same time, it does have this quality of, well, the perennially eternal mouth. That is the thing that's always trying to swallow up the world, take in the world, become that unity from which it came. And so much of the trauma or the sense of separation that human beings experience is related to the fact that that unity has been lost, and yet it is a clear memory. It is what we believe your thinker Freud called the oceanic state, or the oceanic feeling, that feeling of being one with the ever-flowing sea of existence. And here the child finds itself immediately before childbirth, and then it is ripped into a world of definitions. And this varies a bit from different cultures, but you may notice, as this source was speaking about the dissolution of bodily boundaries that humid heat seems to bring about, that is, for the child who comes into a cold environment, well, both literally and, let's say, metaphorically, there is a greater degree of pressure to separate taking place. Well, that is not to say, of course, that this is not a process that happens universally, also to people who are born into hot and humid circumstances. But it is to say that often the separation that happens for children of the cold is more immediate, it is more shocking, and it makes for a more suspicious mind. And the suspicious mind is exactly the expression of duality. It operates from the baseline of duality. It operates from the baseline of being juxtaposed, and thereby having the idea that I am a boundary and I am something defined, I am a unique and completed vessel, and therefore everything around me potentially threatens to upset that order. And therefore, what I have brought forward, what so many entities have brought forward in these types of communications, is the attempt to align you with a different type of energy, or a different metaphor of what it means to be human. That is, if you find the order in growing, if you find the order in being a process, if you find the order in being a type of weird movable organism, a plant animal that produces very unique flowers in its personal expression of itself, you will notice that there will be stages, there will be things that pass you by, and when these things have passed you by, they no longer serve you, much as the caterpillar can no longer sustain itself on green leaves once it has become a butterfly, and there it may have to resolve to taking in more, let's say, effervescent nutrition. And this is a metaphor that you keep being brought back to by me and by so many other entities, because this is where the treasure is buried for you. It is in knowing that duality is something that you use to construct yourself and to bring about this flowering. And so therefore it's necessary for you at some point to feel an opposition to, for instance, the food that you take in. Because the food that you take in is somehow something that is other than you, that becomes you and grows you. And if you did not have this skeleton to work by, this type of blueprint to move by, you would not be able to grow substantially. So within these games of opposition, there is a type of growth. You are feeling out your environment. Your tendrils are pushing up against it, so to speak. And from that, you learn how to grow and how to blossom into that unique, non-dual, unified process, which is actually you. So this is the encouragement that I'm bringing to you. It is to play around with these images of yourself as a newborn, and then to realize, well, how did I move? How was my movement exactly from that newborn state of complete acceptance, of complete integration, of complete non-discrimination, that is not evaluating the reality that you find yourself in. Did I become an opposed being, a juxtaposed being, a being that defines itself, boundaries itself against a world of opposites that seem to be out there? And how have I unified these two perspectives? And have I unified these two perspectives in my adult life? Am I both able to limit myself when necessary? And am I able to open up and take in what is needed when necessary? Because you are a very, very complex plant. The flowers you are growing are very complex. They are novel to this planet, and indeed they are novel in this universe. You are, by growing the way that you are growing, showing off the garden of you to the entirety of divine intelligence that permeates everything. And that is the wisdom that I wish to impart on you. It is this idea of learning to select the stage where you find yourself, and you do this by intuition. And from there you let go of the selection, and you simply let that thing flow into you and become a part of you, and integrate it as it has thus been. You find yourself in a new state of selection, pushing up against new boundaries. And here you again begin to discriminate exactly to integrate. Therefore, I, the Lord of Consciousness, Lord Shiva, I bless you, and I bring you divine wisdom and love from on high and into this space where you humans, you reside. Peace this day. Om Shanti. Yes, Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. I hope you took something from that, guys. Much love to you.